side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So you see, the video is quite biblical, isn't it? They had a little texture to it, and that's okay. They didn't distort the video. They didn't distort that. We hear that phrase over and over and over again over the last 9 weeks. Your faith has made you well. Your faith. I think by now we should be getting a picture of one of the things that might be important. Your faith has made you well. He said that to the leper. He said that to the blind beggar. Other times he didn't say those exact words, but he said things like, "Go back home because you believed it. It's happened." And she was healed. And he said to another woman, "Your faith is great. Your request is granted." Her daughter was instantly healed. So there's a connection here, isn't there? Faith, healing. Faith, healing. So I got to thinking about this. This woman had suffered 12 years. She had basically gone bankrupt with doctors trying to cure this. Janet and I have some friends down, well, actually they live in Florida most of the time now, but they have a home in Perry. He grew up as a farmer. He had a big farm. And his wife came down with cancer in her throat and her neck. And it was extensive. And because of the cost of her treatments, they lost everything they had. When we met them, he was managing a farm called Malachi Farms around Marshallville, Georgia. Well, today this man is quite wealthy. God has replenished all he had lost. But medical bills can be devastating to somebody. And this woman knew that for 12 years. She spent all her money, and the thing was, she had only gotten worse. And she was obviously a reject of society. Ritually, she was considered by the Jews to be unclean because that's the Old Testament about women, okay? And she couldn't go into the women's court in the temple to worship. She couldn't be around people because they touched her. They were ceremonially unclean, and they had to go through the whole cleansing process. Can you imagine what a miserable life this is? She'd been estranged from her family. She said, "I'm nobody's daughter anymore." And there are people who feel that way. They're so wrapped up in their suffering. Physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. They don't feel like they have a connection to anybody anymore. But Mark says she had heard about Jesus. In the video it says she heard it from a blind man. All Mark says is she had heard about Jesus. You know, I was reading this past week that one of the things that people in the church most fear, I'm going to test y'all this morning, okay? One of the things they most fear is when the preacher starts talking about evangelism. Because people have this idea that I'm telling you, you got to go out and stand on the street corner. Every Sunday when Jen and I go home, there's a man stands on the street corner in Waynesboro, right there on that corner there, with a microphone, and he's preaching. The cars are going by with our windows up. We can't even hear him. But he's faithful. And some people have this idea that we're expecting you to go out and knock door to door, and grab people by the lapel, shake them, say, if you don't get saved, you're going to die and go to hell. No. All we're asking to do in the church, in evangelism, is tell somebody about Jesus. Specifically, tell them what he's done for you. That's all we're asked to do. You're not asked to be a theologian. You're not asked to explain the way of the Bible, to make excuses for God about why things don't always go. No, just what has he done for you? And she said in the video that she had heard it from a blind man. A blind man who obviously was very thankful for what he'd received from Jesus. And he wanted to share that. Because there he was. I'm told I've never been to Israel. I was going to go after I was ordained. Bishop Watson gave all the ordained a trip to the Holy Land. And about 2 weeks after we were awarded that trip, all hell broke loose over there, just like it is right now. We never got to go. And I was looking forward to going. But I'm told by people who've been there many times that the streets like that are very narrow. They're cobblestone and brick and rock, and they're pretty hard. It's pretty hard walking in some of those little village streets. But if you can imagine, you've got this tiny little corridor, and Jesus is there, and he's causing a scene. You notice there are Pharisees, and the video does a good job. There are Pharisees always around watching, trying to catch him, trying to snare him. All right? A couple of them, like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they're kind of listening, and they're learning some things. But the crowds were just gathering around. Why? Because they had seen that Jesus was doing things. He was changing lives. And folks, that needs to be the message of the church today. Jesus still changes lives. Physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, he still changes people. He still restores people. And he said to her, your faith has made you well. The Greek word is sozos. It really means you've been saved. And so when he pronounced her healing, he said, now go in peace. So for her, it was a complete makeover. Not only was her physical problem taken care of, but now her emotional and her spiritual issues had been dealt with as well. And by faith, by her faith in Jesus Christ. Now her faith was a little bit misdirected, wasn't it? It was in his clothes. There's another story in the Bible where people would touch the handkerchiefs or the cloths of some of the apostles, and they'd be healed. Or if their shadow would fall on them, they'd be healed. Do you think shadows have magic properties? I know they'll drive a dog or a cat crazy if you play with them with it, but that's besides that. Yeah. And do you think clothes have magic properties? No, he said, it's not my clothes. It's your faith. And so she becomes very resolute. The crowd's trying to stop her. The Sanhedrin, they're trying to stop her. The man says, you're unclean. Get away, get away. But she says, and I like it in this video, just one thread. Just one thread. Now, Jewish men wore a tunic, which is kind of like their underwear. All right? Then they wore what's called a talith. That's the thing that has the tassels on it. That's what she touched. She grabbed a tassel. And that is biblical, by the way. That is biblical. But she was not going to let the naysayers and public opinion dissuade her from getting her blessing. And she was not too proud to get on her knees to receive it. There's a story in the Old Testament, a man named Naaman. He was a powerful warrior, a pagan, by the way. And in his household, a little Jewish girl who had been taken into exile, into captivity, And even though she was in captivity, she still had compassion on her master. And she said, if my master would just go see the prophet, he'd be healed. Well, Naaman has become desperate. He's willing to try anything, This woman is desperate. And he goes to see Elijah, and Elijah sends out a messenger. Naaman got really ticked off about that. Well, I thought for me, he would have come out here. So now we let our pride steal our blessings. We let our pride get in the way of God doing marvelous things in our lives. Maybe we don't want to be exposed. We don't want people to know what our one lady says, I don't want everybody to know what my business is. Dear heart, God already knows what your business is anyway. That's the only one you got to worry about. The rest of them can't fix it for you. But God can. And He's waiting for you to have the resolve to reach out and take your blessing. All I've got to do is just touch one thread. And right now, you ought to be asking yourself, can I touch Jesus today? Can I get close enough to Him that I can touch Him and receive what I need? You know, Jacob, there's a story in Genesis where Jacob wrestled with what we think is an angel. And it gets daylight, and the angel says, you better turn me loose. I got to go. And he says, I'm not going to turn you loose till you bless me. And, of course, the angel knocked his hip out of joint. Jacob had to live with that the rest of his life. But he called him, he renamed him from Jacob to Israel, didn't he? And he said, because you have wrestled with God and prevailed. I'm not going to turn you loose till you bless me. If I can just touch one thread. Do you have that kind of faith? Don't answer me. Just think about yourself. Do you have that kind of faith? There was no question in her mind that Jesus was her healer. None left. You didn't hear anything. You don't read anything that says, well, if I can get close to Him, I might be healed. She didn't say that. Yeah. If I can just get His attention and talk to Him, He might. No. If somehow I can gain His favor, no. If I can just touch one thread, I will be healed. That's putting it on the line. Your faith has made you well. When we come to the next part of our healing service, I'm not sure when it's going to be yet. The Lord hadn't revealed it to me. Y'all, I'm operating totally on the Spirit right now. You may not understand that, and I'm sorry if you don't. But I'm not doing anything until God says otherwise. But here's what I want you to take away from this morning. Jesus felt power leave Him. See, her faith was a connecting point. But our healing always comes from the power of Christ, from the power of God. Salvation comes through how? It comes through faith, but only through the power of what Christ has done for us. This is not new theology for you. The faith of some enabled them to receive healing. The Bible tells us in Matthew 13 that sometimes some weren't healed because of a lack of faith. Matthew 13:15, He did only a few miracles there because of their unbelief. See, I think that describes the modern day church. We've become so rational, so sophisticated in our understandings of how things work, that we're really not prepared to see the power of God unleashed among us. And when we do, it scares the bejeebers out of us because we don't expect it. And if I can do anything in all this, it's to create an attitude that we expect to see God work. We expect to see God work in the body of Christ and through the body of Christ. We expect that because that's what His Word says. But our faith is only an instrument. Our faith taps in to the power of God for healing, for salvation, for whatever your needs are. So I ask you this morning, do you feel like you can touch Jesus? Do you feel like you need to touch Jesus? You know, for an old fat guy, I'm pretty healthy. My doctor said I'm as healthy as a horse and as big as one too. But over these last 8 or 9 weeks, I've become increasingly aware of how much I really do need to touch Jesus on a regular basis. And I can't let you, I can't let my wife, I can't let anybody or anything stop me from doing that. I heard a little grumbling last week about that I've been on this series of sermons now on healing for 9 weeks. A little bit of grumbling. About time to move on, preacher. Dear folks, it is time to move on when God says it's time for me to move on. All right? I'm trying. You know, I'm a half a step out of eternity, as most of us are. Just a half a step, all right? I'm trying to make sure I'm in good shape before I get there. Yeah, that's all. And that means that I have to open my heart and let God reach in there and just pour in a blessing and clean out all the yuck, yeah, and get me ready. But I want to be obedient. I want to tell you here this morning, you can touch Jesus today.